Greetings, scholars. I hope you're well. We're going to be covering chapter 11, personality. I'm going to run through the entire chapter and kind of give us some different theories about how we think about personality, how we develop personality. We'll talk about various different aspects. So we talked about psychodynamic theory. We talked about humanist theory, behavioral theory. We'll also talk about the biological theory of behavior and personality as well. So there are various theories that um, have been posited by a lot of our more prominent psychologists and theorists. And so we'll dive into each of these theories in kind of detail, and we'll cover two or three different theorists who have their different ways of thinking, like I said, psychodynamic, um, behaviorist theory, humanistic theory. And we talked about those theories earlier in the class in chapter one, looking at the foundation of psychology and how we are and why we are who we are. But these same theories then can be applied to personality and how we develop our personality. And so we'll talk about that, and then talk about some other cultural things that cultural differences in personality, some of the similarities in personality across cultures, and some of the differences that we see. And we'll end on that note. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so just the nature of personality. What is personality? So personality itself is just any individual unique set of consistent behavioral traits. And so when we talk about consistency means that your behavior over the course of time and across situation is pretty stable. So when you are going to a party, your behavior in that party is pretty stable for who you are and your personality type. Either you're pretty extroverted or introverted, right? And so you're either working the party, going around and meeting new people, or you're kind of introverted and kind of hugging the wall, or being around people that you're really comfortable with and people that but you're consistent over the course of time. Someone who is optimistic is going to be optimistic no matter what the situation is. They're always going to see the silver lining in situations. You can be overly optimistic about something, and you can have someone that's really neurotic, and we'll talk about neuroticism, which is kind of the anxiousness and um, people who are really high emotionally and really kind of mentally weak, not weak, but they are. I'm trying to think of a good word. They're kind of sensitive emotionally. That's the word, sensitive, and highly sensitive emotionally. And so we'll talk about those things as well. And then also one of the other um, characteristics of personality is our distinctiveness. So we're extremely unique, and we all react to this. We might be in the same situation, but we react very, very differently. So say three of us were on an elevator and we were stuck on an elevator. One of us might be really, really calm, cool, and collected, and would just say, "Hey, let's just wait for help." The other one would start to panic, began to cry because they don't want to be stuck on an elevator, and then the other one would, act like he's MacGyver and try to figure out how to work our way out of the situation by trying to opening the door and try to climb our way out of the elevator. But again, you have those various uh, differences among people reacting to the same situation. So the distinctiveness and then the consistency. And as we talked about, our personality does evolve over time, and so we have to be mindful of that as we talk about personality, because you don't stop evolving as a person, right? You don't stop evolving as a person, and so we have to be um, really cognizant of how we explain personality in terms of consistency, again, across situations and over time, and the uniqueness, our uniqueness as people, and the distinctness of our personalities. Okay? One of the several ways that we identify different personality traits is through a statistical technique called factor analysis. And what factor analysis does is it takes several variables and it looks to see how those variables are correlated with one another. And if those individual variables are highly correlated, then those variables then might create this uh, personality trait. right? And our personality trait is just a disposition we have to behave in a particular way, right? If you're extroverted, you're going to be outgoing, you're going to be high energy, you're going to, um, be a little easier to get along with, right? Versus someone who's a little more introverted, or someone who's less open to experience, right? But again, this technique is kind of originated in psychometrics. So they were looking at different um, characteristics and traits of individuals, and they were kind of giving them a survey or giving them certain questionnaires and assessments and having them fill them out kind of in a candid way. And they were able to determine who um, was in kind of a certain disposition, right, based on the different characteristic traits that were highlighted through factor analysis. So you can think about an example. Um, General athletic ability. You have several variables that are highly correlated with general athletic ability, being able to run fast and being very strong and being able to jump high, and being able to have balance and coordination. All of those things are correlated together with someone who has, high general athletic ability. And so those um, individual variables, throwing, jumping, batting, weightlifting, all those things kind of combine to create a single factor like general athletic ability. Most approaches that we see assume that there are some traits that are more basic than others. So the big five personality traits that we'll talk about, openness to experience, extroversion, neuroticism, um, all of these different basic personality traits are then make up some of the vast individual, specific individual characteristics that we see in people. Okay. So extroversion, and we talked about the five factor model, and a lot of these factors were factor analyzed with the statistical technique, and there are various um, variables like being outgoing, being social, being upbeat, friendly, having a positive outlook. Those are individual variables that then combine to form this very simplistic extroversion variable, right? So if you're not very outgoing, if you're not very sociable, if you're not very upbeat, if you don't pursue social contact, then you're less likely to be extroverted and more likely to be introverted. So depending on how you answer your particular questionnaire or assessment depends on where you'll lie in that continuum. Very extroverted or very introverted on the details, and then on the middle you have the continuum where you might lie somewhere in the middle. You might be what we call an ambivert, who can kind of navigate both extroversion and introversion. And then neuroticism, again, being very anxious, hostile, very self-conscious and insecure. Neuroticism is kind of correlated with kind of negative emotionality. And those who have low neuroticism, they're a little less anxious. It's not to say that they don't have negative emotions. They just don't feel as high in impulsiveness and emotionality. And then openness to experience is really curiosity, flexibility, being very open to exploring different things. Many students on campus, you'll see if they're open to experience, they'll try just about anything. One of the basic examples is, going to a restaurant. They'll try just about any food. They'll try just about anything. Um, they'll be very curious about their environment and go explore no matter what. Okay. You have agreeableness and then you have conscientiousness. And again, all of these individual variables are combined into one single factor. And so you have compassion and cooperativeness and straightforwardness. You have diligence and organized and punctual, dependable for conscientiousness. And again, all of these are kind of the basic personality traits for individuals, and they've been studied for decades. Okay. When we talk about the five-factor model, there are some correlations to some lived outcomes and life outcomes. For men and women, there are kind of modest differences between gender. So females might tend to score slightly higher in agreeableness and neuroticism, and even on conscientiousness. Women tend to be a little more conscientious than men are. But again, there are very, very modest differences in gender based on gender. The five big traits have some other correlations to, tendencies and life outcomes, like I talked about before. So grades, higher grades are usually earned by individuals who are more conscientious, they're more organized, they're they're going to tend to work harder. More of those who are more creative in achievement in the arts, they tend to be higher openness, so they like to explore and get out and see what's out there. Career success are those who more conscientious, but it really depends on the person, right? If you're a salesman, being conscientious, being extroverted might lend well to that specific job. But if you're, say, you're an analyst or a computer analyst, you might not have to be as extroverted. You may have to be really, really conscientious. And then individuals who are neurotic doesn't necessarily mean that that's bad. Some people who are neurotic actually are a little more realistic, and they pay closer attention to detail, right? Since they are really, really high, have a little high anxiety, and they're more critical. Them being more critical allows them to be more more apt to see different things and observe different things in their environment, and they make you know better decisions. People who are a lot less neurotic may make a little more brash and uncalculated decisions, but someone who is neurotic is probably going to make a more calculated decision, and the decision making might be a little better. Okay, your likelihood for divorce for those who are more agreeable in conscientiousness and have more conscientiousness, their level of the likelihood of the divorce will be decreased. For those who are on the opposite ends of those, you may have a higher likelihood of divorce. And the neuroticism is associated with elevated prevalence of physical and mental disorders. You think about being a little more anxious, your anxiety is going to be a lot higher. And so that's going to create those physical and those mental disorders. We talked about how our body responds to certain situations. And so when we have a high anxiety, we're going to, different hormones are going to be released in our body, which then creates some physiological issues in the long term, if not handled in the right way. Okay. So here are the different perspectives of personality. And so we're going to go through each four of these, and then we'll talk about the contemporary approach. There are two different contemporary approaches to personality that we'll talk about. But we'll talk about psychodynamic, behavioral, humanistic, and biological. Each of these has different supporters for each of these. We talk about Sigmund Freud. We talk about B.F. Skinner, B. Watson. We talk about Carl Rogers and Alfred Adler, humanistic biology. Eisnick for biological, and we'll talk about a few of these other contemporary theorists here at the end. Okay, so the psychodynamic perspective. When we talk about the psychodynamic perspective, we have to go to Sigmund Freud. He's one of the most famous psychologists, and his psychoanalytic theory was based on our unconscious thoughts and how those unconscious thoughts influence our behavior, which then also contribute to our personality and how we exhibit our personality and characteristic traits. And according to this approach, these unconscious thoughts are a part of what we're kind of unaware of. Our feelings, our thoughts, and our urges, the memories we have, all kind of influence our behavior and influence our personality and how we behave in certain situations. And he focused specifically on the influences of our early childhood experiences, the conflicts that we have on the inside. We have basic urges. We'll talk about the id, the ego, and the superego as a model. And then our sexual urges. And the urges of sexual urges don't necessarily mean that we're sexual beings, but it's about the pleasure that we receive in certain things that we like to do, right? So the urges that we have are not just purely sexual intercourse with the member of the opposite sex or the same sex. It's the pleasures that we derive from certain things that we are really interested in doing. Again, contemporaries of are really, really uncomfortable with the sexual urge piece, right? Because it's said that, we are masters of our own thought, right? We can control. We're not just bound by the unconscious and the instinctual behavior of our, natural urges, right? We do have some control, right? Some facility over our thoughts and what we do and how we begin to think about ourselves. And we are in control of our own destinies, right? We do make decisions based on conscious thought and awareness of what's going on in our environment. And then the sexual urges piece, coping mechanism did offend and has offended some conservative culture. You think about talking about sex is pretty taboo in our more conservative culture. So it did kind of go against some of the more conservative ways of thinking for some of those theorists. Okay, but the structure of personality and what Freud wanted to uncover was the levels of awareness and how our personality kind of was exhibited in the levels of awareness that we have. And we have the id, the ego, and the superego. And the id, again, is those pleasures, a pleasure principle. It's the most primitive part of who we are. It's those urges that lie way below the surface, and we're having to kind of get them under wraps, right? It's us it's us seeing someone, right, that we're really attracted to, and we have this really kind of intense lust over this person, right? And we don't act on that lust because we have this ego that's helping to kind of mitigate those things, right? It's kind of keeping it under wraps, right? So the id is that instinctual, raw biological urge, right, which demands immediate gratification. Some things that might not be as controversial may be just hunger and thirst, right? If we're hungry and thirsty, that's a natural, raw biological urge. We can go get food pretty easily. But one thing that we may not be able to do is we may not be able to attack somebody physically that has made us upset. We might be able to jump on someone that's made us upset. So our ego and then our superego then helps us to kind of keep that under wraps. And the ego is that decision-making component. So it weighs the options, right, and the consequences, thinking forward, right? In reality, we can't just ravish someone if we're sexually attracted to them. We have to have some decorum, right? We have to have some control and some self-discipline. And then the superego is that moral component, and it emerges out of, our ego around 3 to 5 years of age, and it continues. That's one of the hits against this theory is that it takes places a lot of emphasis on early childhood, but again, we continue to develop our ego, our morality over the course of time as we evolve, and this superego is that social standard about right and wrong. So it's telling us, okay, it's not right to slap that person if I'm really upset with them in that meeting. I have to again keep that urge down, and instead of slapping them, I might, say something kind, or I might maybe speak to them in a different way, maybe in a passive aggressive way. But I'm not going to be outwardly and overtly aggressive to someone in a meeting at my job because I want to keep my job. Right? That's the reality. Okay. With the tension that we have, the anxiety that we feel when we're trying to keep those raw biological urges down with the ego and the superego, it does create some anxiety. You think about you having a big crush on somebody and you're really sexually attracted to someone, you have this lustful attraction to someone. There's this tension, or you wanted to slap somebody who wronged you in a meeting, right? They threw you under the bus for something that you may have done that they said they wouldn't do. That they wouldn't throw you under the bus for something that you missed out on. And, there's this anxiety that comes into play. And in order to kind of buffer the anxiety, to kind of relieve the distress and the anxiety that we feel, we use anxiety or defense mechanisms, right? And these defense mechanisms are kind of largely unconscious things that we don't even think about. And it protects us from those unpleasant emotions that we feel from the anxiety and the guilt that we might feel through and in certain situations. One of the different defense mechanisms, we'll talk about 5 of those, 7 of them. Rationalization, right? So we create a false, plausible excuse to justify our unacceptable behavior, right? So we just rationalize it, right? We steal something from someone, or in the when people loot, or they have this rage, right? Maybe they stole something from the store, and they're like, you know what? Well, everybody else does it. Shoplifting is something that someone else does, something someone else has done. So I just rationalize it away. Regression is something that keeping distressing thoughts, repression, keeping those thoughts buried under the unconscious, and this happens when maybe it's some traumatic event that occurred, or something that you don't want to deal with that kind of brings up kind of distressful and really negative emotions, and you want to keep those buried down. Projection is attributing your thought. Oftentimes, it's something that's negative to someone else. Maybe you're a really jealous person, but you project on someone else, and you say that they're jealous of you, right? That's how someone attributes your own thoughts to someone else, and you kind of take away some negative emotion or negative characteristic of yourself, and you try to push it off on someone else. But again, here are some others, right? We'll talk about displacement, talk about the reaction formation, regression, rationalization, of course, identification. But again, the arousal that we talked about is kind of a crucial event in the functioning of personality functioning, right? So when we talk about anxiety, which is really extremely distressing, we use these defense mechanisms that we talked about, a couple, and then we'll finish off on a few more, okay? But here are some of the others, and I won't go through all of them, but again, take a screenshot of this, save this. The slides will be posted on the Blackboard. But all of these have some unconscious feeling, and we use them to kind of buffer ourselves from the distress or emotional distress that we might feel, the negative guilt that we might feel. So in regression, someone reverting back to immature patterns of behavior. I don't know if you've ever watched Bridezilla. That's a guilty pleasure of mine. I watch it with my fiance, and when some of the brides to be don't get their way, they revert back to throwing temper tantrums and being really childish and spoiled, right? And so again, we see that over and over again when there's an anxiety, there's a kind of a conflict on the inside, and anxiety is creating this conflict on the inside. Okay? So again, with Freud's model, you have this kind of intrapsychic conflict with the id, the ego, and the superego, this anxiety you're trying to push those biological urges down, and that conflict that's happening on the inside is creating the anxiety here that we see. And then we rely on the defense mechanisms to kind of buffer and to handle the anxiety that we have in our natural situation that we deal with. And we all have defense mechanisms. We all use them in certain ways. No one is void of using a defense mechanism to protect themselves from anxiety that they feel. Another instance or kind of place where Sigmund Freud went was what we call the development of what we call the psychosexual stages. And again, when we talk about the sexual stage, sexual term is used in a general way to kind of refer to those urges for physical pleasure, not sexual pleasure, but physical pleasure in a sense of, if I, for those who chew on their pen, right, and they chew on gum, they have a oral pleasure, right? They derive pleasure and stimulation from chewing things, right? And so that's not to say that it's sexual, but there is an oral fixation on that, chewing on things, biting on things. Those things have something to do with that, right? But these developmental periods have a characteristic of sexual focus that affect adult personality. So you have oral, anal, phallic, latency stage, and genital stage. And again, these are very, very sexual in nature, but not necessarily derived. They're derived in a sexual nature, but just simply talk about the physical pleasure that we get in these certain things, right? So the oral stage, kind of the erotic focus on the mouth. Infants derive pleasure from oral stimulation, sucking, biting, putting things in their mouth, right? They do it all the time. That's how they explore the world, and they have this fixation with it. Even into the age of 2, 3, 3 to 5, they still put things in their mouth to explore their environment in a way. The anal stage is an erotic focus on the anus, right? So bowel and bladder control, potty training experience. So we're having an dilemma or crisis with trying to potty train, right? And the way parents potty train, right? If they're really supportive or if they're really critical, that can depend on how long the young person kind of stays in this anal stage, right? Someone who's really, really anal is someone who is really neurotic, right? They're really anxious. They have a lot of negative emotionality. And so we have to be really cognizant about, in each of these stages, how young people are being reared so that they kind of develop and move through these stages in a healthy way. The phallic stage is the erotic focus on genitals. So we understand now that we are different from females and males, right? We have different genitalia, and there's this focus. Young people usually touch themselves in that way. They focus because it's something that's novel to them. They can, that you have different parts than a female does. The latency stage is where you don't fixate so much on any one thing, right? You might have, oral, anal, and phallic, fixation, but during this stage, sexuality is largely suppressed. So I'm building relationships. I'm not really concerned about, uh, you know, a lot of the fixation on physical pleasure, but I am getting and deriving some of my pleasure from, peer relationships, hobbies that I'm enjoying, other interests. So I'm really interested in sports, right? Music, art. And so I'm really focused in on building those relationships, social relationships, and focused in on some of the things that I love to do. The last stage is the genital stage. We go back to kind of focusing on, um, you know, the puberty and then to death. You kind of have these maturing sexual interests. This is kind of talking about sexual pleasure. And we develop this strong sexual interest in members of the opposite sex or same sex, depending on one's sexual orientation. And the interest in welfare of others grows, right? So we're less focused on the fixation of things that in physical pleasure that we derive from and receive, but the help and altruism and the pleasure that we give and can offer to someone else, right? Someone in the genital stage, this leads to people being a little more altruistic, more having more helping behavior characteristics, right? So again, each of these stages, and it's we talk about stages. You could be in the oral stage and the anal stage and the phallic stage at the same time, right? There's not a hard cutoff for each of these stages, and we kind of move through the stages kind of seamlessly in a continuous fashion. Okay. One of the other proponents to the psychoanalytic theory, and one of the, I'm going to say, proponents to something very different than what Sigmund Freud was suggesting is Carl Jung, and we'll talk about him. But again, he talks about the vision of a collective unconscious, which can't be really studied. It's not really empirical, and so it's not as popular of a theory. But what we do see, though, is that each person has a conscious and unconscious level of awareness. We know that, right? Each person can think conscious thoughts, and we have this unconscious, personal unconscious thought that are very, very different from each person to the next. We determined that. But what Jung tried to determine tried to explain was that we all have this deeper, unconscious, genetically inherited experience, from our traditions and our trains of thoughts and our values, our beliefs. And there's this kind of universal collective unconscious, which, those what we call hidden ancestral memories or archetypes. And again, these are those beliefs, traditions, values that everyone is familiar with in the unconscious, and they help to influence our behavior, overt behavior. But again, it's so hard to track this empirically, so it's not really supported and hasn't been really supported. But the unconscious and the conscious thought for each individual person is something that we have kind of held on to as psychologists. Okay. The third psychologist that we'll talk about is Alfred Adler, and he talked about the importance and the emphasis on our motivation to strive for superiority, to strive for the ultimate self. Right? I want to be the best I can be, and that's our hugest human motivation is superiority. We want to be better, right? And when we feel inferior to others, we're going to do everything we can to develop the abilities to be better and to overcome those inferiorities. And that's what we call compensation. So when you're compensating for something, that means you're learning something, you want to develop a skill in order to level up. We want to be better. We compare ourselves to other people, and we're striving to be more superior and more powerful than people around us, right? And that's in a individualistic sense, especially in Western culture. This is really, really popular because we are all wanting to be better and more powerful. And again, we overcome that by trying to get an education, learn a new skill. All those things help us to, again, overcome the inferiorities. Adler focused his specifically on our early childhood experiences and how that in and of itself can create some issues with our thinking of our superiority and our human motivation to be better, right? He said that when parents are pampering or parental neglect has a negative or positive influence on individuals and their development of their personality. Those who um, have what we call parental neglect, uh, they have what we call an inferiority complex, and we'll talk about that, which is a exaggerated feeling of weakness and inadequacy. When you feel like no one is, and we'll talk about conditional love, where you feel like you have to do things to be loved, you have to act and behave in a certain way to be loved, then you may feel a certain inadequacy when you're not being loved, when you aren't shown love. You might feel like you're inadequate because people aren't showing you the love, and you have to do things to feel and to get the attention that you want. Overcompensation is used to deal with the feelings of inferiority. When I don't feel like I'm enough, then I overcompensate by maybe, you know, uh, bragging about something I've done or buying something that will give me some sense of some importance and status, right? Or again, acting in a certain way, bringing, having an air of myself that gives me some sense of inferiority, or not inferiority, superiority to someone else, and taking away or talking about people in a certain way, right? When people feel inferior, they may joke on somebody else to take the attention away from them. They want to make someone else feel inferior so that they feel more superior. And that happens when people try to overcompensate. Birth order is another concept that he spoke on as a factor in governing our personality. And, we grow up if we are, different, if we're born in certain parts or different birth order. So the older sibling, middle child, the younger child, they grow up in different settings, right? In different situations. And their parents treat them very differently. And so when the parents treat them differently, then they might develop, either inferiority complex, or they might compensate in a way to, again, um, overcome the inferiorities that they see from comparing themselves to their siblings. Right? But when we evaluate the psychodynamic perspective, we talk about the unconscious forces that can influence behavior, and there is some validity to that. But again, that internal conflict can also play a key role. But when we talk about the criticism, right, there's going to be criticism from every perspective that we talk about in this chapter. We overemphasize the case study, right? Case studies are very, very well done, but we can't just emphasize case studies because they don't always and can't always be generalized to other people, right? To the general public. It's also very poorly tested, right? The ideas are extremely vague, and so we can't be really specific about certain hypotheses and test those hypotheses with empiricism, because again, we have to rely on people to tell us what they're feeling, what they're thinking, because of the unconscious nature of behavior of this perspective. A lot of evidence has been contradictory. We talk about the importance of the first 5 years. We understand now that there is some importance to the first 5 years of life, but we do continue to evolve over time. There's also a thing that we call the opedial complex, where children have a fixation to an attraction to their mother or the same sex, right? So the son is going to have an attraction to his mom, and then harbor negative feelings about their dad because they're competing for attention. Vice versa, females have a competition; they're competing against their mom and have an affinity to their dad. That happens sometimes, but they put too much emphasis on the effect of that and how important it is to the development of a young person, because we do overcome those types of complexes over time. They also placed a lot of emphasis on dreams, which is very subjective and has really contradictory evidence on if it does support our personality development. And the last one is sexism. A lot of the research that was done was male-centered, had a male-centered point of view, and it had a sexist bias against women because they used the deficits that they thought women had to describe their personality. A lot of what Sigmund Freud did was he said that women had this what we call penis envy, right? That they wanted to have a genital like a male's genital, right? And so there was a bias against women in a way that their personality had a lot of deficits to it, which is not the case at all. Okay. So when we talk about the psychodynamic perspective, it says Hugh viewed the quest of superiority as a universal drive to adapt and improve oneself and masters life challenges. So if we think about that, you'd have to select Carl Jung Albert Adler. He was really important about giving the incidents that we are all striving for superiority. We're motivated by improvement and again achieving our true potential. And that one way that we do that is by striving to develop the abilities to overcome our inferiority or the inferiority that we see as we compare ourselves to others. Okay, the behavioral perspective. We'll talk about a few different psychologists. When we talk about psychoanalytic, we also have to talk about behavioral perspectives because that is one of the keys to our behavior. We talk about behaviorism with learning, conditioning, operant conditioning, and they do have some validity to how that kind of develops our personality, but it does lend itself to some oversimplification in how we develop our personality and how it places a lot more emphasis on the social aspect and not enough on the cognitive aspect that we do have as a result as well. Okay. So behaviorism again is that orientation that all the scientific psychology should be studied using observable behavior. Right? Anything that we can't observe should not be studied because we can't quantify it. We have to rely on individual subjective nature of individuals to rely on them, okay? To tell us what they're thinking, to tell us their thought process, to tell us their dreams. We have to rely too much on the individual. But B.F. Skinner, his idea applied to personality is the determinism concept or construct, which means that behavior is ultimately determined by our environmental stimuli. And that has a big role, right? And our personality is just a collection of those tendencies. We have response tendencies tied to certain situations, right? So think about this. If we're in a party, someone who's introverted, they're at a party, and they go through a party in a different way than someone who might be extroverted. They go into the party, they scan the room, they find someone who is, someone maybe they know, so they introduce themselves to people that they know to say that kind of tell people that they're there, and then they get kind of engrossed in a conversation with one person, right? Or they find interest in maybe a book collection that someone has at their home. They're kind of just going through the library of their books, and then since they've kind of spent their time there, they find a way of escape. They don't have to stay any longer. They're like, you know what, it's time to go. Versus someone who's extroverted, they work the party, they go in, and they look at the room, they look at the people that they know, but then they also find people that they don't know to introduce themselves to them because they're really open to meeting new people, and they derive pleasure in again expressing themselves to other people in the room. Telling a joke, right? You tell a joke, someone laughs, so now you tell more jokes, right? Or you tell a joke, no one laughs, they say it's corny, and you never tell a joke again, right? You don't tell as many jokes, right? So you're discouraged by punishment and reinforcement to act and behave in certain ways. So again, a specific situation may be associated with a number of different responses, tendencies, and they vary in strength depending on your past conditioning. So if you go to parties And that's the way you enter parties as an introvert. You kind of stay to yourself, to talk to people that you know, and then you leave prematurely. Or maybe if you're telling a joke, right? You tell a joke and someone laughs at it, people laugh, and people tell you you're funny. They reinforcing your joke telling, so you're going to continue to tell jokes. Again, and then just being impulsive. People who are really, really impulsive. If you're really impulsive, and somebody calls you out on being impulsive, right? So you're punished for being really, really impulsive. Then you don't you're not as impulsive anymore. But if somebody doesn't really check you on your impulsiveness, then you continue to be impulsive, right? And so again, different situations and associations and conditioning plays a big role in that as well. Um, but again, when we talk about the behaviorist theory, especially with B.F. Skinner, personality development, again, it's very, very different than Sigmund Freud, who said the early childhood experience is kind of the key and it is essential. And it really is. But B.F. Skinner says that personality development is a continuous lifelong journey. And our behaviors are always going to be conditioned in a way by our environment and what we call the determinism construct. Right? Albert Bandura took behaviorism a step further and he incorporated cognition into it, and he called it the social cognitive theory. Social cognitive theory, excuse me. In the social cognitive theory, uh, it also says that we are shaped, in fact, by our behaviors and through learning, but we do process information through cognition about the environment to maximize favorable outcomes. So, say for instance, you are at work and you're working extremely hard. You're really helpful. You are always early to work, staying late after work. You're doing your projects. You're working again really diligently. You have a lot of conscientiousness, and you get a promotion based on that. Right, you're rewarded for that. Right, so you continue to do it. You're rewarded for it. You got a promotion, so you continue in that vein because again, you have processed the information about your environment. You know that in your working environment, they love people that work hard, and for those who work hard, they get ahead. Right, but for those who don't, you know, they don't. And so or you're in a working environment and you don't, you see that someone is, slacking off and, nothing's really happening to them and they're getting promoted. They're getting the better opportunities. Then, you just slack off too, because you see that. Right. But again, he also talks about observational learning, which we talk about, where you're influenced by observing others. Right. So think about this. Your older brother talks back to your dad. Your dad slaps him in the mouth, pops him in the mouth, right? You're less likely to talk back to your dad now because you saw your older brother. He was a model, right? He got popped in the mouth. So you're like, no, let me take a step back, man. I'm not gonna talk back to my dad because I just saw my brother get popped in the mouth. I don't want that, right? And so once you observe something, you then use that as a model, right? You hold it up. You're like, no, I'm not talking back to my mom, my dad, because there I could be punished for doing that, right? And then the other aspect or concept that is talked about in observational learning is what we call self-efficacy. And self-efficacy is my belief, your belief about your ability to perform a certain behavior and that it should lead to expected outcome, right? So again, we talked about I'm really confident in my ability at work, and I know that if I work extremely hard or study really hard for an exam, I'm going to do really well and get an A. And so I'm going to continue to do that because of my self-efficacy. The things that I have really high self-efficacy in, I am more willing to accept those challenges. I like being challenged because I know I can do it. I believe I can do it. And for those things that I don't and not as confident in, I'm going to kind of shy away from that because I know that I'm not as well versed in it. Right. So I'm going to shy away from it. But I'm motivated to, again, attack challenges that I know I have high self efficacy in because I have a belief in the ability to perform a task. And I know the outcome is going to be great if I have self efficacy in it. The other concept that we'll talk about by Walter Mischel is the focus on the situational behaviors and not so much that, but kind of a person situation context. Right? We talked about it before. People make responses they think will lead to a reinforcement in the situation at hand. So you believe in hard work. You believe in hard work. You believe it's going to pay off. It leads to raises. You're probably going to be more diligent and industrious at work. So it kind of ties into the previous theory that we talked about, right? You're looking at the environment, you're looking at your self-efficacy as well to see, okay, what's going to lead me to a certain outcome, right? And do I have enough? Do I believe that I have enough ability to make it happen? Okay. Um, what Walter Mischel was able to uncover, however, is that people exhibit far less consistency across situations than we had widely assumed, right? Depending on what type of situation you're in, depends on how you're going to behave. Someone who is introverted in one situation may not always be introverted because in their family dynamic, they might be a little more extroverted because they know the persons they're around people that they really, really love, right? And enjoy. It's the same with me. In a crowded environment of strangers, I'm probably going to be a little more introverted and act a lot differently. But in a crowd of people that I really am interested in and know, I'm an extrovert. I go around and talk because I'm more comfortable in that setting, right? And then behavioral theories are specifically firmly rooted in extensive empirical research. So research has shown that again we don't behave in the same situations, and research has kind of highlighted um, that idea that we do change uh, based on the situations that we're in and the context that we're in over the course of time. Some of the criticisms to behaviorism: behavioral theories aren't very behavioral anymore. Obviously, the cognition is extremely important. So there's a marrying of the two, behaviorism and cognition, because we have to be able to process information in order to learn about different um, reinforcements and punishments that we have in an environment. Cognition has to be taking place so that we're processing the information of our environment and how we need to behave based on what we've seen, um, based on observations, or again, the reinforcement and the conditioning that we've had in our environment. And behaviorists, another criticism is that behaviorists kind of indiscriminately generalize uh, animal research to human behavior, right? Humans and animals have complex thought, right? So we think a lot differently. Now, animals may have personalities too, in a way, right? They have a disposition, but they don't behave in the same way as humans do, and so we can't uh, always generalize animal research to what human behavior is and how it functions. Okay? So, according to Albert Bandura, it says which of the following influences the challenges people tackle and how they will perform. And again, let's go back. Albert Bandura, we talked about self-efficacy. And self-efficacy, like I talked about before, it again allows you to tackle certain things. You're going to tackle a challenge that you know you're really confident in and you have ability to do it. And you're not going to tackle issues and challenges that you know you don't have the ability to perform. Right. So your self-efficacy plays a big role. I'm giving you the answer because I want to highlight that your self-efficacy, especially in various contexts, plays a big role in how successful you're going to be. If in your academic environment you have really high self-efficacy in certain courses and certain classes and certain topics, then you're going to do very well. If you're really confident and have self-efficacy in your belief in math, perform well in math, you're going to do well in math because you're going to accept the challenge. You're going to work more. You're going to work harder. You're going to be a little more industrious, and you're going to see the results versus someone who has less self-efficacy in certain topics. So again, self-perceptions of self-efficacy of influence the challenges that people tackle and how they perform. Okay. All right, the humanistic perspective. Right. One of my favorites. I'm a big humanist. I enjoy behaviorism as well, but there is I'm more of a positive psychologist, and I want to focus more on the positive side of personality. When we talk about behaviorism and we talk about uh, psychodynamic, so there are some hits against it, right? So we the unconscious, we have free will, we can make decisions. We are masters of our own fate. That's one thing. When we talk about our unconscious, behaviors or unconscious thoughts don't always control every piece of our behavior. Our conscious behavior does, our conscious thoughts do influence what we do, how we behave. And then also behaviorism. We're not completely controlled just by our environment, right? There is a marrying of cognition. We have the ability to control what happens in our environment as well, right? We don't always and aren't always influenced specifically by our environments. We are masters again of our own fate and can make decisions to improve our own situations, right? But the humanism perspective is just that orientation that emphasizes our unique quality as humans, and it's kind of the backlash against, like I talked about before, behaviorism and the psychodynamic theory, because they assume, and I say we because I am a humanist in a way, because I feel like we can rise above those conflicts, the unconscious conflict that we have, those kind of primitive animal heritage that we talked about. We do again have that anxiety that we talk about, and we do use defense mechanisms, but we can rise above it, and we've seen it over and over again in how we behave and interact with individuals. We can overcome those primitive instincts that we have that lie in the unconscious. People are conscious and rational beings, right? So we're not just dominated by those irrational conflicts that we talked about. And not everyone is helpless to their environment. Not everybody's just helpless and deterministic forces by the situations that we're in. We have some control over those things. And so that's part of what we assume as theorists and psychologists. Okay. Carl Rogers is one of the most prominent humanists, and what he wanted to uncover was the idea that we have potential for movement and human potential, right? We are beings that have and want to seek the highest potential, and we'll talk about Abraham Maslow, who's another humanist. But again, Carl Rogers was the father of this train of thought. His one concept was the concept of self, right? How do we think about ourselves, right? And self-concept is just our belief about our own nature and its unique qualities and our typical behavior, right? It's our kind of mental picture of ourselves. It's how we see ourselves, right? Do we have a positive self-concept or do we have a negative self-concept, right? Are you easygoing? Are you pretty? Are you hardworking? Are you not so smart, right? What is your self-concept? And my biggest goal, what we want to do for you, is when you come to college, you come with one self-concept, but we want a transformative environment, and not just lend ourselves on just uh, you know getting A's and B's, but I want your self-concepts to change, right? I want your thinking about who you are, your unique qualities, your own nature to change, and we want to change your thought processes so that your self-concept improves, and you have a positive self-concept. Um, Often, people tend to distort their experiences to promote more favorable self-concepts, but I want you to have an accurate self-concept, right? And that goes into, again, being really self-aware about who you are, what you possess, who you're going to become, right? The gap between who you think you are and the actual reality of who you are, right, is what we call incongruence, right? The smaller the gap that we see, right? So we see. Let me get my laser pointer here, right? So we see this overlap. This is called congruence. This is where this is more congruence. This is less congruence. This means that my self-concept, I feel like I'm really intelligent. I feel like I have high self-efficacy in statistics and mathematics, and my actual experience is pretty accurate, pretty spot on. So there's some overlap. I might be a little more grandiose in my thinking about how I feel about statistics, but it is pretty accurate, right? Um, some people have a self-concept that they are extremely pretty, right? On the outside, people don't think they're that attractive at all, or they feel like they're extremely talented in a sport. I've played football and played sports with individuals who felt like they had and were extreme athletes, really, really talented, and they were not as good as they thought they were, right? So there was not as big of an overlap. But you want people who are really confident in who they are, and then you want their actual experience to be. Those who have, incongruence, a lot of incongruence, self-confidence concept does not kind of mesh well. Usually they're a little more arrogant and they kind of delirious in a way, right? And those are the people that, sometimes you want to just put them back in their place. You're not that good. You're not that pretty, right? Which is not, not the case. I mean, we want to be really, really kind and do it in a place of love, but we do want them to be realistic in their self-concept and their evaluation of their self-concept. Okay? So Rogers views personality development in terms of conditional love and unconditional love, right? And conditional love and unconditional love help us to develop a more accurate or less accurate view of our self-concept. So conditional love leads us to kind of distort our experiences, right? So we're doing things for people to love us, right? And so we view ourselves in a certain way, and then the actual experience is not the same. And so we have this incongruent self-concept, and that leads to a reoccurrent anxiety, and it triggers defensive behavior. If my self-concept and my actual is not matching, oftentimes I have this anxiety. And what happens when we have this anxiety? We have these defense mechanisms, right? So when you have more congruence, you have more peace. When it overlaps a little more, you have more peace. You don't have to be as defensive. And when people say something to you, you know who you are. You know your self-concept. You know that your reality is nearly the same as your self-concept, and so you have more, or you have more of a confidence and self-esteem. When you don't have a congruence and it's not as overlapped, then you build anxiety, your self-esteem, your confidence is shot, and you do things just to please people. And we don't want to be in the business of just pleasing people, right? We want to operate in unconditional love, because when you operate in unconditional love, you build a more healthy self-concept that is congruent with your reality, and you're more confident. You have higher self-esteem. You have higher self-efficacy, so on and so forth, and you become and reach your potential in a better way. Okay. All right. So that's Carl Rogers. We have Abraham Maslow, another famous one of my favorite psychologists. But he says that people must satisfy their basic needs before they can satisfy higher needs. And what happens if you are, satisfying some of your higher needs? You kind of met some of your basic, you met your basic biological needs. But what do you think happened when um, COVID happened? Right now, some of my physiological needs are being met. So now I have to kind of abandon some of these up here to go back to establish some of these safety, physiological needs of hunger and thirst, right? So now I'm kind of reverting back to some of those really basic and physiological needs that I needed at the beginning. So we regress, right? If lower needs are not being satisfied, we have to regress back, right? And we progress once these needs are being satisfied and have been satisfied, then we can move kind of back up to kind of, aesthetic needs, cognitive needs, and then realizing my fullest potential. And that's the ultimate, is realizing your fullest potential. When we can do that, then we have a person that's really confident in who they are and really open to experience and doing really well for themselves. But again, you switch from progression to regression depending on your situation and circumstance that you're in. Okay, those who have what we call a self-actualization or a self-actualizing personality. These self-actualizing people, these individuals have a growth toward, a drive toward human and personal growth. And that's what we're striving for at Alabama A&M. We want you to be and strive for your personal growth, not just in the classroom, but even outside of the classroom. We want you to develop self-actualization, right? That need to fulfill your potential. That's the highest need that Abraham Maslow has introduced, right? So it's what a man can be, he must be. And a man is always trying to strive to become what he wants to be, right? And when we aren't what we want to be, then we develop this anxiety and this distress in right? But those who are self-actualizing people, they are really efficient. Their perception of reality, they're they have a lot of spontaneity, simplicity, right? They love and appreciate freshness and newness, right? They are more ethical in discrimination between, good and bad. They have a feeling of kinship, right? They have this idea that they are moving towards something greater, and they treat better. They treat people better, right? They like to be around people. They like to help others. They have this altruistic behavior. They are, again, between kind of this polarity in personality. So they don't kind of hang in extroversion and introversion all at one time, or they kind of move in a continuum and are kind of fluid in how they move through their personality. But we want self-actualizing people, right? We want people who feel a sense of uh, fulfillment and are striving to be their best self, and again, and are driving toward personal growth in a really positive and influential way. Okay, the humanistic approach, again, made the self-concept an important construct in psychology, and self-concept is extremely important as we talk about giving people a sense of self, and then creating their reality to match and be in congruence with uh, their actual self-concept. That's what we want. We want that mesh to be a lot closer instead of being a lot more spread out. We don't want a lot of incongruence. We want a lot of congruence so that your anxiety, your self-esteem, your self-efficacy is improved. Critics argue that the humanistic theories, you can't really put them to a scientific test, um, but there may be ways that we can discover them, and maybe it is with kind of some psychometrics. We talked about the factor analysis, so figuring out how we can determine self-concept and how the self-concept is and moves kind of in congruence or not incongruence with, or not congruent with your actual self-concept. And then humanists have been unrealistically optimistic in their assumptions. But again, you have to be optimistic sometimes to see the silver lining in situations. And then more empirical research obviously is needed to solidify the humanistic view. Since the theory is kind of difficult to put to a scientific test, um, we do need some empirical, quantitative, and even some qualitative research to kind of solidify and support some of the claims that have been made by the humanistic views. So it says, which major theorist called his approach a person-centered theory and argued that an incongruent self-concept tends to promote anxiety and defense mechanism. If you can remember this, you should have selected Carl Jung, or Carl Rogers, excuse me. So Rogers says that, again, that concept of incongruence makes one prone to reoccurring anxiety, which triggers defensive behavior, those defense mechanisms that we talk about. Okay. So the biological perspective, this talks about the genetics and heredity of personality from parents to siblings and how we might share personality through our genes that are shared between people, right? So personality, again, is largely shaped by one's genes. Again, this is one other perspective, and it's been studied. We'll see in some subsequent slides, but it has been studied that genes do play a role on top of some of the other situational and circumstantial behavioral things. Nature and nurture also play a big role and they work together to give us what we consider our personality. So Hans Eysenck model of personality, he described personality as a hierarchy of traits. So you have these superficial traits that are derived from a smaller number of basic traits, and then those traits are derived from a handful of these fundamental higher order traits. So when you think about extroversion, when you think about openness to experience and neuroticism and conscientiousness, um, agreeableness, all of those are kind of those higher order traits. And then those higher order traits then have those superficial traits from that, that dive down, right? So the higher order, that one node, and then you have some superficial, and then you have some responses that are created. And those higher order traits and those superficial traits then lead us to those habitual responses that we have to certain situations that we're in. But again, special interest has been tied to explaining the variations in extroversion and introversion. And extroversion and introversion, those who exhibit those personality characteristics, again, they differ in their um, habitual responses to certain situations. So introverts acquire more of a conditioned inhibitions, right, through their environment. So they tend to be more bashful. They tend to be a little more tentative and uneasy in social situations. And so those are some of the superficial characteristic traits that are associated with being more introverted versus being extroverted, where someone might be extroverted, they're less bashful, they are a little less tentative, and they are a little less uneasy in social situations when it comes to the condition of being in a social situation where they have to communicate with someone else. Okay, so again, these are our higher order, characteristics or traits, and then you have those specific, uh, lower order characteristics and traits. And after you get here, this is extroversion. Right? So you have being sociable, you have being lively, active, assertive, sensation seeking, right? And through these superficial traits, then you have these habitual responses uh, to certain situations, right? So if you're sociable and you go to a party, right, you're going to have specific responses. Somebody comes to you uh, and introduces themselves, and you're like, "Hey, how's it going?" Right? And you have a specific response, and you go into a detailed, specific responses and how you react to certain situations and responses and in circumstances. Okay? When we talk about genes, right, personality being, highly influenced by the genes that we share with other people, twin studies help us to get an understanding about those big five personality traits, right? And so we see that genes do play a pretty big role in um, the sharing of personality and similar personalities among twins, both fraternal and identical. But twin studies, like we talked about, show that genetic makeup, right? So with identical twins, they have 100% of their genetic makeup is shared. With fraternal twins, about 50% of their genetic makeup is shared. So with identical twins, you see that they're more similar in their personalities than fraternal twins are. So they had twins, and you see the N here. That's an N of five. So these are it's very, very small sample sizes, right? So 5 pairs of identical twins and fraternal twins in each of these sets, right? So they're able to see that, um, you know, one twin took a study, or, he answered questions based on extroversion. The other identical twin answered the same questions, and their scale score was correlated about, 0.5, which is a pretty moderately high correlation. And you see openness to experience, conscientiousness, agreeableness, not so much, neuroticism also, right? They share some of similar characteristics in their personality. So that means heritability is about 50%, right? And it explains a good percentage of the variance in uh, their personality types and their personality traits. So if you did R squared, this would be about 25%. So about 25% of the variation in their personality trait and extroversion is explained by genetics. It's explained by um, them being identical twins, right? But again, this is even true when twins are reared in different homes. So it has nothing to do with um, uh, it kind of hits on the situational and the environment piece, right? So it's not so much the environment, but it has a lot to do with the genetics, right? And then, very surprising, the shared family environment has very little to do with little impact on personality whatsoever, right? We thought it had something to do with it, but like we see here, even when identical twins are reared in different homes, they're not in a shared environment. They still kind of share similar personality traits and characteristics in high levels. Okay? So we move from the biological, we move to the evolutionary approach, uh, which explains that some of our big five personality traits, we exhibit them because they help us to um, survive and be adaptive to environments, right? So for someone who needs to be really open to experience, I need to be able to explore. I need to be able to experiment. I need to be creative to design things to help me survive. To be neurotic, I need to be a little less neurotic because I need to be able to handle stress and anxiety a little better. To be extroverted, I need to be able to be outgoing. I need to be able to build relationships with other people in order to uh, heighten my survival. I need people. I need a group to help survive. I can't do this in isolation. To be conscientious is to be orderly and um, to be organized. Right. I need to be able to organize laws, and I need to be able to uh, work hard. I need to be industrious. Being conscientious, I need to be able to have self-discipline. All of those things help to again create and survival. Okay, but again, really important for those adaptive implications. That's what we're talking about. The natural selection. We selected these big five personality traits because they helped us to adapt and survive when we and our ancestors were coming up centuries ago. Okay? When we evaluate the biological perspective, we do see that biological factors do shape personality. But we do see that there are some meager effects of uh, family environment on personality development, which, we see that, right? We're looking at the nature piece, which is, again, hitting on the biological factors of genetics and heritability for personality. But then the critics assert that there's too much emphasis on heritability estimates. Uh, but again, it's not placing as much, right? Because we do posit that again, environment and genetics play a big role. So it's nature and nurture, not nature or nurture. It's both, and they both influence the personality development for human beings. And again, they're not what we call independently or entirely independent from one another. All right. So some of the newer research that's been done on personality development has focused its attention on narcissism. And narcissism is that personality trait marked by an inflated sense of importance, a need for attention and admiration, and a sense of entitlement and a tendency to exploit others. So they're a little less um, altruistic, they're a little more self-absorbed, and so they focus more on themselves and less on other people around them. So they're going to focus more on their well-being and less on the well-being of other people. The term is drawn from the Greek myth of Narcissus, and so if you remember this, if you can recall this myth, um, Narcissus saw his reflection as he was looking at himself in a pool of water, and he fell in love with himself, and he fell in love with his reflection, and he stared at his reflection until he died. Right? So he was so in love with himself that he stared himself to death. Right? Narcissists are often well liked at first, right? So they have a great personality initially, right? They come off as really confident, have high self esteem, and then over time that declines. Their popularity declines because you can see that they're a little less agreeable. They're a little less. They might be highly extroverted, right? But again, that extroversion is really self-centered, and they're doing it for themselves. You have two types of narcissism that we'll talk about here, and then the third one, we'll talk about collective narcissism. But the first two here, grandiose narcissism, this is characterized by an arrogance, right? Extroversion, modesty, and aggressiveness, right? This is the one where they're really outgoing, they're out there, right? We all know at least one or two that are really grandiose narcissists. A lot of um, celebrities, which we'll see next, have become grandiose narcissists. Um, Donald Trump is one, right? Arrogance, extremely extroverted, immodest, really aggressive, right? Aggressive. So we can see that in some celebrities based on how they grew up, what kind of situation they're in. Very entitled, very spoiled, fed a silver spoon his entire mouth, and I mean his entire life. Uh, and then you have what we call vulnerable narcissism. It's kind of in contrast to being really extroverted. It is uh, characterized by a hidden feeling of inferiority, right? Introversion, neuroticism, and a need for recognition, right? So they have this sense of I don't feel like I am enough, right? But I want people to feel sorry for me so that, they give me attention. These are the people who, you know, they're not always out there, but they act like something's wrong, so you'll come talk to them. They kind of look down, what's wrong? And now they're getting that sense of, again, the need for recognition, right? They're really introverted. They have a high sense of anxiety, emotionality, and a feeling of inferiority. And they use that inferiority complex to kind of make people feel sorry for them. And that when people feel sorry for them, they feel good when they're getting the attention that they want. Here are some classic celebrity narcissists, and you can go through and name some instances where Ye, Matthew McConaughey, Mariah Carey calls everybody's darling. She just treats people like, I think she bathes in like milk, like or some warm buttermilk or something. I don't know, something crazy. Like she just does stuff that um, you know makes you question. Um, Kenya Moore, I thought, was a narcissist, and I think some things situationally um, create narcissism in people. But I saw Kenya on this reality TV show where she was like doing some really like military type television show, and she was amazing. Like she was extremely down to earth and humble, and not narcissistic whatsoever. A team player, but I think in certain circles she has to be narcissistic because of situations, and many of these might be similar for them too. But Donald Trump is just he's just a narcissist, man. And he again, you can look at his face, really smug. Again, it's based on his situation, how he grew up, um, and how he is as a person. Collective narcissism. This refers to an inflated belief in the greatness of one's country, or ethnicity, or religion, or other social group. And so, for people who have high sense of patriotism for the United States, right? When anybody says anything against the United States, they feel like you're attacking them, right? Uh, I'm a, you know, I'm a Pentecostal. I am Baptist, and you talk about my religion. You talk about my denomination. How dare you, right? They get upset when people talk about their ethnicity, Black Power, right? Having um, some a sense of self and being Black. When people come against me, and talking about my skin color, then I'm offended by that. I'm threatened by that, right? And this collective narcissism can also lead to uh, some group bias, right? So I have some prejudice and some discrimination against other groups, in group, out group, and we'll talk about that when we talk about social behavior. But again, it does create a sense of uh, superiority for that group who feels like they have uh, this high sense of inflated belief in greatness of their particular social group. Those who are narcissistic, again, is correlated with positive extroversion, negatively correlated with agreeableness and honesty and humility. And that speaks for itself. Those who are really highly narcissistic, yeah, they are going to be extroverted. They're going to get out and be open and outgoing, but they're not going to be all agreeable. They don't care about anybody. They don't care about many other people, right? They care about themselves. They're not going to be all that honest, and they're not going to be all that humble, right? They're going to be really braggadocious and brag about what they have and other things, and they're going to buy things that make them look better and bigger and more important. They're going to boast about their accomplishments, what they've done, and they're going to be entitled to you, knowing who they are. You don't know who I am. You got to know who I am, right? Um, so we got to be mindful of that. It happens all the time. One of the other contemporary models here is the terror management theory. And terror management theory explains, it helps to explain why people need self-esteem. Self-esteem acts as a buffer for anxiety that we have about death and life and moving through life. So we all have this self-preservation instinct, and this inevitability of death creates anxiety. And the anxiety buffer is the self-esteem, right, that we have, right, about maybe our group that we're in, or belief, cultural view that we have. Right? So the worldviews that we know, that we have, that we hold about our groups, our the people that are in our life, right? We hold these views and we create these stories and traditions and institutions, and it soothes the fear of death because we have a sense of identity about something that we're part of, and it increases our self-esteem. The mortality salience is again that degree, and people are who are have this higher mortality salience. They have what we call, they increase. They work harder to defend a cultural worldview because they want to defend and buffer the anxiety that they feel about death at the end of their life. And self-esteem comes in because in order to kind of buffer this, I need to enhance a feeling of self-esteem through um, that defending my cultural worldview. I have a high self-esteem. I know who I am. I know where I'm from. I feel great about who I am because of the power that I get from my culture and my group and my fraternity or whomever or whatever else. I have this sense of self based on that. Okay. So it says those who are overly sensitive to criticism of their groups and see it as a sign of disrespect likely have, you should have selected collective narcissism. Okay. All right. We've got a few more minutes and then we'll get out of here. So when we talk about the role of culture and personality, you have to think about two dimensions. And we'll talk about interdependent and independent. And culturally, the independent personality or self-system, um, you have the Western culture. We're more independent, right? So the basic dimensions of personality trait, again, structure may be nearly universal, but we see that there are some differences and some distinctiveness between those who are um, in the kind of American culture and those who are kind of Eastern Asia, Eastern cultures. American culture fosters an independent view of self, and this view of self kind of highlights and emphasizes the unique strengths and achievements become the basis of the sense for self, right? So I'm not really connected to anybody. I'm kind of myself, right? Um, I've achieved what I've achieved based on me. I'm not really dependent on anybody. Um, people say that they're self-made. A lot of artists, a lot of rappers say I'm self-made, and they take out the mother and the father and their friends and the coworkers and their siblings, um, and they pay less attention to and homage to those individuals that help them, and they say, "Hey, I made it. I did the work. I'm hardworking. I made it." Right. In contrast, Asian cultures encourage an interdependent view of self uh, as a part of an interconnected social matrix. So instead of it being just me, I did it. My achievements, it's my self worth. I get a lot of my self worth in an interdependent view based on um, my social structure, my social relationships. I am who I am because I'm someone's daughter. I'm someone's sibling. I'm someone's colleague. I am employed here, right? My coworkers help me to become who I am. My achievements that I've received and have gotten are because of people who are a part of my social relationships, a part of my village. And I feel a bigger sense of self when I tie my sense of self to other people because I know that they play a big role in who I am and how I define myself uh, in my personality. Okay. So we're going to end there. Um, we'll talk about these different chapter themes, but again, behavior, psychodynamic, all of these things play a big role. The social historical history context, we talk about how our views of self change over the course of time. Psychology is obviously theoretically diverse. We talked about different perspectives, psychodynamic, humanistic, behaviorist. We talked about various theories over the course of through those various dynamics and perspectives. So again, very, very theoretically diverse. And when we talk about diversity, there's a lot of insight in each of those perspectives and diversity perspectives. Um, and there are some cultural differences. We talked about the interdependent and independent self-system, um, but again, very important as we talk about personality and development. And our personality and who we are is influenced by our upbringing. It's influenced by the people around us. It's influenced by our social circumstances and situations, things that have happened to us. And, uh, you know, we have to be mindful of that as we talk about and experience um, our life. And so we'll have an activity where I want you to explore your personality. I want you to write about, what things have you experienced? Who has helped to shape your personality, who you are, who you become, and who you're becoming as a person. All right, so we're going to end there. I hope you all have a great one, and we will see you next lecture.